The air inside the excavation chamber was thick with dust and anticipation. Sarah Ellison wiped the sweat from her brow as she crouched near the exposed relic, its dark metallic surface etched with symbols that no human had ever deciphered before. The ruins beneath the sands of Rygos had remained untouched for thousands of years, but tonight, under the glow of artificial floodlights, history was about to be rewritten. Behind her, the rest of the expedition team murmured excitedly, their voices a mixture of human and alien tongues. Among them stood Kael of the Telnar, a towering figure of regal bearing, his deep violet skin gleaming under the lights. His golden eyes, sharp and analytical, regarded the artifact with something between reverence and apprehension. "I would advise caution, Dr. Ellison," he said, his voice rich and measured. "The inscription suggests this device was of great importance to the ancients. Activating it may carry unforeseen consequences." Sarah shot him a look, half amusement, half exasperation. "Every great discovery carries risk, Kael. That's what we're here for." She reached out and placed her gloved hand on the artifact's surface. It was cool, unnaturally so, even after centuries buried beneath the shifting dunes. The moment her fingers made contact, the relic pulsed. A deep, thrumming resonance filled the chamber. Then, light. Blinding, searing light. A force like 1,000 hands seized her mind, her very essence, and she felt herself being pulled, intertwined, with something vast, alien, and utterly unfamiliar. She gasped, but the sound never reached her ears. Because she wasn't just in her own mind anymore. She was in his. The sensation was overwhelming. Sarah's thoughts, emotions, memories, everything that made her her, were no longer confined to the walls of her own consciousness. There was another presence, a second awareness pressing against hers, vast and structured, ancient and disciplined. Kael. For a moment, there was silence, the shared space between them taut with disbelief. Then his thoughts surged toward her like a tidal wave. Impossible. She reeled back, except there was nowhere to retreat to. Her body still knelt before the artifact, unresponsive, but her mind was everywhere. Her senses overlapped. She could feel Kael's controlled breathing, the warmth of his body, the disciplined cadence of his thoughts as he struggled to contain his shock. "Sarah." His voice resonated not through air but directly inside her mind. She flinched. "Kael? What the hell just happened?" He was silent for a moment, and then a pulse of recognition flickered between them. Not words, not sound, pure understanding. "We are bound." Sarah's stomach turned. Bound. The words settled into her like a lead weight. She tried to move, her fingers twitched, but it was sluggish, unnatural. It was as though her body now belonged to two people at once, requiring a mutual agreement to act. She felt him testing the bond as well, probing at its limits, attempting to withdraw. But there was no separation, no way to pull free. This was no mere psychic connection. It was deeper, fundamental, permanent. Outside their shared consciousness, the expedition team had descended into chaos. Shouts rang out, human and Telnar alike rushing toward Sarah and Kael, their faces distorted with concern. "Sarah, are you all right?" Professor Lindholm, her senior colleague, knelt beside her. "Can you hear me?" She opened her mouth to respond, but at the same moment, Kael tried to speak as well. Their voices clashed in an incoherent garble, overlapping thoughts bleeding into one another. Frustration surged through her. "Stop talking over me. I was about to say the same to you," he shot back. Sarah scowled. This was not going to work. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, one that she was sure he felt too, she focused on regaining control. She needed to separate her thoughts from his, to find some semblance of autonomy within this impossible connection. "Kael, let me speak." He hesitated, then relented. She turned to Lindholm, managing a shaky nod. I'm here. Something happened when I touched the artifact." "That's an understatement," muttered one of the scientists. "It glowed, and then you and Kael collapsed." Kael straightened beside her, his expression composed despite the storm she could feel beneath his surface. "This device has done something unprecedented. We must determine the extent of the bond before attempting any further interaction with it." Lindholm looked between them, noting their synchronized movements, their unusually similar tones. "You two sound," he hesitated. "Strange." Sarah grimaced. If only he knew. Kael exhaled. For now, the artifact should be secured. No one else should touch it. His words resonated with an authority that silenced any objections. The Telnar were a proud and ancient race, their culture steeped in hierarchy and tradition. Kael was no mere historian. His presence here signified that this relic was of grave importance to his people. Sarah could sense it now. His duty. His burden. She shook her head, overwhelmed by the sheer depth of his thoughts. If she wasn't careful, she would drown in them. We need to figure out how to break this, she told him privately, focusing on their mental link. Kael's golden eyes met hers. Agreed. But beneath his composed exterior, she could feel what he wouldn't say aloud. If it can be broken at all. Over the following days, Sarah and Kael endured a relentless struggle against their unnatural connection. Simple actions became a battle of coordination, walking, speaking, even eating. If one of them wasn't careful, the other would feel the phantom sensation of a movement they hadn't made. Worse still, their memories bled together in moments of weakness. Sarah would find herself recalling distant star systems she had never visited, battles waged between Telnari factions long before humanity had even reached the stars. In Kael, she could feel his discomfort every time he accidentally glimpsed her own past, childhood laughter, the sin of old books in her grandfather's study, the quiet ache of a life spent chasing knowledge at the expense of personal connections. The bond was not just an inconvenience. It was intimate. Dangerously so. Then came the dreams. Visions of the past. The true past of the artifact. Sarah and Kael saw through the eyes of the ancients, those who had once wielded this device not as a curse, but as a covenant. The artifact had not been designed to trap. It had been designed to unite. And they were not the first to share such a bond. The dreams came without warning. Sarah and Kael drifted in a realm neither of them could control, an endless expanse of shifting light and shadow, where voices whispered in a language long forgotten. They weren't merely watching memories. They were experiencing them. Sarah could feel the weight of heavy ceremonial robes draped over her shoulders, a symbol of authority. Kael felt it too. They were one, inhabiting the same being, yet still themselves. A vast chamber stretched before them, lined with towering pillars covered in golden glyphs. At its center stood a figure, tall, with elongated features and eyes that shimmered with the knowledge of ages. A being neither human nor Telnari. The bond is sacred, the figure intoned. Sarah felt Kael's sharp curiosity spike through their connection. "Who are you?" she asked, though she had no mouth to speak. The figure turned its gaze upon them, and in that moment, they felt the weight of time itself pressing down upon their souls. "You were chosen. The binding is eternal. It cannot be undone." The vision shattered. Sarah bolted upright, gasping for breath. The dim light of the excavation tent flickered, casting long shadows against the fabric walls. Across from her, Kael sat up just as suddenly, his golden eyes wide with recognition. "You saw it too." His thoughts reached hers before he could even voice them aloud. She swallowed hard, still shaking from the intensity of the vision. "This isn't just some ancient relic. This artifact was made for something bigger." Kael's expression darkened. "And if it cannot be undone, then we may be bound forever." The days that followed were a blur of failed experiments and growing frustration. Every method they tried to sever the bond ended in disaster. Sarah attempted to focus her thoughts away from Kael, but the effort was exhausting, like trying to ignore the presence of her own heartbeat. Kael, ever the scholar, devised intricate mental exercises to compartmentalize their consciousness, but their minds remained stubbornly fused, thoughts bleeding into one another without permission. Even physical distance offered no reprieve. When they tried to separate, an unbearable pressure built in their skulls, forcing them back together. But the real danger was yet to come. On the third night after the vision, their excavation site detected an incoming ship. It was sleek, obsidian black, moving with unnatural precision through the thin atmosphere of Rigos 4. Kael's muscles tensed the moment he saw it. Sarah felt his reaction through their bond before he spoke. "That is no friendly vessel." The ship bore no markings, no insignias. It was neither human nor Telnari. It was something else. The ship landed with an eerie silence. No traditional propulsion systems, no rumbling engines, just an ominous stillness as its sleek hull touched the sand. Sarah and Kael stood side by side, their minds locked in silent understanding. Their team had already taken defensive positions, a mix of human and Telnari scientists clutching their weapons with uncertain hands. A hatch hissed open. 3 figures emerged. They were humanoid, but wrong in ways that set Sarah's instincts on edge. Their armor shimmered like liquid obsidian, shifting with each movement. Their eyes were too large, too hollow. Then one of them spoke, its voice slithering through the air like oil. "The binding has been awakened. Give us the artifact, and we will spare your lives." Kael's response was immediate. Cold. Unyielding. "No." The leader of the intruders tilted its head, as if amused. then you have already sealed your fate. Before anyone could react, they moved. Too fast. Blades of energy flickered into existence. Screams rang out as the first of the scientists fell. Sarah's vision blurred, not from fear, but from something deeper, something primal. The bond between her and Kael flared to life, and suddenly, they weren't separate individuals anymore. They were one. Kael moved with the reflexes of a warrior trained since birth, and Sarah moved with him, their actions synchronized with supernatural precision. She felt his instincts guiding her body, felt her own thoughts shaping his movements. A soldier lunged for them. Sarah ducked, so did Kael. She spun, a motion neither of them had planned, and Kael's fist struck the attacker's jaw with bone-cracking force. They knew each other's moves before they made them, and in that moment, they realized the truth. The binding was not just a curse. It was a weapon. The battle was over in minutes. The intruders had not expected resistance from a bonded pair. Their leader, wounded, seething, staggered back toward the ship. "This is not over," it hissed, black ichor dripping from its wounds. "The binding belongs to us. You will not escape your fate." The ship lifted off, disappearing into the void. Sarah collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Her muscles trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the raw power she had just wielded. She turned to Kael, and in his golden eyes, she saw the same realization that had just struck her. "We're stronger together." He nodded slowly. "But if they come back, they will." Sarah exhaled sharply. The artifact had given them something that others coveted. And now, they were targets. She clenched her fists. They could no longer afford to waste time searching for a way to break the bond. No, they had to understand it. Before their enemies returned. The camp was silent in the aftermath of the attack. The bodies of fallen scientists and Telnari lay scattered across the sand, their blood dark against the pale dust of Rygos. 4. The survivors worked in grim silence, tending to the wounded and securing what little remained of their expedition. Sarah and Kael stood near the artifact, its eerie glow now pulsing in rhythm with their own heartbeats. Their bond had intensified during the battle, their movements synchronized beyond anything either of them had thought possible. It was terrifying and exhilarating. "We need to leave this planet," Kael said. His voice echoed in Sarah's mind before he even spoke aloud. "If they return with reinforcements, we will not survive." She nodded. "Agreed. But we can't just run blindly. We need to understand what this artifact is and why those things wanted it so badly." Kael's golden eyes darkened. "I may have an idea." He led her back into the ruins, deeper than they had explored before. The tunnels beneath the excavation site were ancient, their walls covered in the same golden glyphs they had seen in their shared visions. "This language," Sarah murmured, running her fingers over the symbols. "It isn't Telnari, and it definitely isn't human." Kael nodded. "The ancients. The ones who came before all of us. Some Telnari scholars believe they were the first great civilization in this galaxy, long before humanity left its own solar system. And you think they created the artifact?" "I don't think," he said gravely. "I know." They stepped into a massive chamber, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Towering statues lined the walls, figures with elongated features and eyes like liquid stars, the same beings from their visions. At the center of the chamber stood another artifact, nearly identical to the one Sarah had touched. But this one was cracked, broken, as if something had forcibly severed its power. Kael stepped closer. "This is what happens when the bond is broken." Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. "It can be undone?" Kael hesitated, his fingers brushing over the fractured surface. "Yes, but at a cost." She frowned. "What cost?" Kael turned to her, his expression unreadable. "One of us may not survive." Before Sarah could process his words, a sharp jolt of pain stabbed through their bond. Kael stiffened, his muscles locking up. "They're here." A second ship descended from the sky, larger than the first. Darker. The remaining scientists barely had time to react before the first energy blast ripped through their camp, sending debris flying. The sand burned where the plasma had struck, glowing embers scattering into the wind. Sarah and Kael ran, not away from the danger, but toward it. "We can't fight them all," Kael warned. "We don't have to," she shot back. "We just have to buy time." More of the black-armored figures emerged, their weapons gleaming under the twin moons of Rygos 4. But this time, they weren't alone. towering war beasts, their bodies a fusion of organic flesh and mechanical plating, prowled beside them. Their eyes glowed with the same void-like darkness as their masters. The leader from before stepped forward. "Surrender the artifact. Surrender yourselves." Sarah exchanged a glance with Kael, and then they moved. The battle was chaos. Sarah dodged a plasma blade that should have cut her in two, but she had felt Kael sense it coming before it even swung. Her body reacted as if it had trained for years in his fighting style. She twisted, kicked, and the attacker crumpled. Kael, moving with equal fluidity, caught an enemy's wrist mid-swing and redirected the blow with impossible precision. They weren't two people fighting. They were one. They don't understand, Kael realized. They think the bond is a weakness. Sarah smirked, ducking under another attack. Let's show them how wrong they are. She grabbed Kael's hand mid-spin, using his momentum to launch herself into the air. He anticipated her movement, adjusting his stance to hurl her higher. She landed on the back of one of the war beasts, driving a plasma dagger into the base of its skull. The beast shrieked, its legs buckling. The enemy commander snarled, "You are an abomination." Kael bared his teeth in something almost like amusement. "And yet, you are losing." But then, pain. A surge of raw agony tore through their bond, and Sarah screamed. Kael staggered, clutching his chest. The commander held up a small, pulsing device. "The binding can be manipulated." The pain intensified. Sarah dropped to her knees, gasping. Their minds, so tightly woven together, felt as if they were being ripped apart. Kael's voice reached her, strained and filled with something she had never heard from him before. "Sarah, if this continues." No, she wasn't losing him. With sheer force of will, she reached inside their bond, pulled. The pain shifted, then snapped back toward its source. The commander's eyes widened. The device in his hand exploded in a burst of energy. Sarah and Kael surged forward as one. Together, they struck the killing blow. The commander fell, dark ichor spilling into the sand. The remaining attackers hesitated. Without their leader, their movements became disorganized. And then, they retreated. The battle was over. Silence settled over the ruins. The survivors of their expedition, battered but alive, gathered around the artifact. Sarah felt Kael's exhaustion through the bond. He felt hers. They had won, but they had also learned something far more dangerous. "They're afraid of us." Kael nodded. "Because the bond isn't just an accident. It's something more." Sarah looked back at the glowing artifact, its light pulsing in time with their own. "What if we're not the first bonded pair in history?" she mused. Kael exhaled. "What if the ancients didn't just create the artifact?" His golden eyes met hers. "What if they were like us?" A chilling thought settled between them. This wasn't just a relic of the past. This was the beginning of something new. And the galaxy was not ready. The survivors worked tirelessly to dismantle the camp, salvaging what they could. The battle had changed everything. Sarah and Kael stood at the edge of the excavation site, gazing at the artifact. It pulsed with the same rhythm as their bond, as if it were alive. They were afraid of us, Sarah thought. Kael's voice resonated through their link. Because they know what the bond truly is. We are not the first. We are not unique. Sarah crossed her arms, exhaling sharply. Then why do they want it? If they fear what we can do, why try to capture us instead of killing us outright? Kael's gaze darkened. Because they need us. A tense silence stretched between them. The realization was disturbing. The black-armored creatures, the hunters, had wielded technology capable of manipulating their bond. They hadn't simply wanted the artifact, they wanted control. Sarah clenched her fists. "We need answers. And we're not going to find them here." Kael nodded. "Then we leave Rygos for. But first, we must ensure the artifact does not fall into the wrong hands." They turned to face the relic, its glow intensifying as if it could hear them. And then, it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts, in raw impressions sent directly into their minds. A command. A destination. A world neither of them had ever heard of. Vishara. Sarah staggered back, gasping. "Did you?" Kael's expression was grim. "I heard it too." The artifact had given them their next step. And whatever lay on Vishara, it was waiting for them. The next few hours were a blur. The remaining scientists, those still alive, were evacuated aboard the research vessel Endeavor. Sarah and Kael knew they couldn't go with them. The bond had marked them as something different, something dangerous. They needed a ship. Thankfully, Kael had a solution. "This is the Ravager," he said, leading Sarah into the sleek Telnari starship buried beneath the dunes, hidden under layers of sand. Sarah let out a low whistle. "You had a warship this whole time?" Kael gave her a sidelong look. "A precaution. One that now seems very necessary." They boarded the ship, powering up the engines as the Endeavour departed into deep space. The Ravager hummed to life, its controls strangely intuitive now that Sarah could feel Kael's familiarity with them through the bond. She slid into the co-pilot's chair, setting course for Vishara. Kael engaged the ship's jump drive. Space twisted, and they vanished into the void. The planet loomed ahead, bathed in the dim light of a dying star. Vishara was desolate, its surface covered in jagged mountain ranges and deep canyons. No signs of life. No transmissions. Just silence. Sarah swallowed. "The artifact sent us here. But why?" Kael's fingers tightened on the controls. Only one way to find out. The Ravager descended, cutting through the thick atmosphere. Ancient ruins sprawled beneath them, vast and untouched. But something about them felt wrong. As they landed, Sarah felt a sudden, sharp pressure in her mind. The bond twisted. And then, they were not alone. Figures emerged from the ruins. Not the black-armored hunters, but something else. Tall, cloaked, silent. Their faces were obscured, their movements unnaturally fluid. And then they spoke, not with words, but directly into Sarah and Kael's minds. "You carry the bond." Sarah shuddered. "Who are you?" The lead figure stepped forward, lowering its hood. Beneath it was a face neither human nor Telnari, something older, something alien. "We are the last of the Watchers. We were once as you are, bound. And we have waited for your arrival." Kael's voice was cold. "Waited? For what?" The Watcher's eyes gleamed. "For the war to begin again." Sarah felt the weight of those words settle deep in her chest. For the war to begin again. She exchanged a glance with Kael, their bond buzzing with tension. He didn't need to speak for her to know what he was thinking. What war? And why us? The lead Watcher stepped forward, robes whispering against the cracked stone. He radiated an eerie calm, but beneath it, Sarah could sense something else, anticipation. "You were chosen the moment you activated the artifact," the Watcher said. "You are now part of something far older than your civilizations. The bond is not merely a connection between two beings. It is a weapon, a force that has shaped the fate of galaxies." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, weapon?" The Watcher gestured toward the ruins around them. "These cities once belonged to the ancients, the first to wield the bond. It granted them power beyond comprehension. With two minds acting as one, they became more than individuals. They became living conduits of knowledge, strength, and will. But such power demands a price." Kael's expression darkened. "And that price was war." The Watcher nodded. "The ancients divided into factions, those who sought to use the bond to elevate their people beyond mortality, and those who feared what they were becoming. The conflict burned across the stars, entire worlds reduced to dust." Sarah swallowed. "And the winners?" The Watcher's gaze grew hollow. "There were no winners. Only survivors." Sarah's thoughts churned, the weight of history pressing down on her. The bond, the very thing that tied her to Kael, wasn't just an accident. It was the remnant of an ancient war, a power that had once shattered empires. And now, it had awakened again. Kael exhaled sharply. "If the war ended, why are you still here?" The Watcher's golden eyes flickered. "Because it never truly ended." He turned, gesturing toward the far end of the ruins, where an enormous structure loomed in the distance. A monolithic spire of black stone, pulsing faintly with energy. That is the core. The last remaining construct of the ancients, containing all that remains of their knowledge. It has been dormant for millennia until now. Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. "Because of us." The Watcher nodded. "You and Kael are the first true bonded pair in eons. Your connection has reawakened the core. And now, others will come for it." Kael's jaw clenched. "The ones who attacked us. The ones who tried to manipulate our bond. They're the harbingers. The last remnants of the faction that sought to control the bond for conquest. They believe the core contains the key to restoring their lost power." Sarah's hands balled into fists. "Then we have to stop them." The Watcher studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "That is what the ancients once believed as well. And it destroyed them." They approached the spire, its surface impossibly smooth, reflecting the stormy skies above. The closer they got, the more Sarah felt it, an awareness, vast and unfathomable, stirring beneath the surface. Their bond pulsed in sync with the core's energy. Kael's voice echoed in her mind. "It knows we're here." The Watchers stopped at the entrance. "Beyond this door lies knowledge and ruin alike. What you do from here will shape what comes next. Sarah hesitated, then looked at Kael. Do we even have a choice? He met her gaze, and in that moment, they both knew the answer. No. They stepped inside. The interior of the core was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Walls of shifting light and swirling data stretched endlessly in all directions. It wasn't a room. It was a consciousness. And then it spoke. Not in words, not in thoughts, but in memories. Sarah gasped as visions consumed her mind. A planet engulfed in flames. Ships locked in battle across the stars. Beings like the Watchers standing on either side of a rift in space, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. And at the heart of it all, a bonded pair. Not just connected. Not just partners. They were something more. They were gods. The vision shattered. Alarms blared through the core. Kael stiffened, eyes narrowing. They found us. The Watchers turned toward the entrance, their expressions grim. The Harbingers have come to claim the core. If they succeed, the war will begin anew. Sarah's hands tightened around the hilt of her plasma blade. Kael took a step forward, his golden eyes burning with resolve. Then we fight. The shadows outside thickened. Ships descended from the sky. The Harbingers had come, and the final battle was about to begin. The sky above Vishara burned with the glow of descending warships. The Harbingers had arrived, their sleek black vessels slicing through the atmosphere like blades. Energy cannons thrummed as they powered up, their lethal glow illuminating the ancient ruins. Inside the core, Sarah and Kael braced themselves. Their bond crackled with tension, the weight of the moment pressing against their minds. We don't have enough firepower to hold them off, Kael thought grimly. Sarah clenched her fists. Then we use what we do have. The Watchers, standing in silent formation, turned their hollow gazes toward them. This is the moment we have foreseen, their leader intoned. The bonded must choose, to wield the core's knowledge, or to let it fall into darkness. Kael's mind was already moving, calculating. If we access the core, can we use its power? The Watcher hesitated. The core does not give power freely. It will test you. And should you fail, his voice darkened. It will consume you. A tremor shook the ground. The Harbingers had landed. Sarah and Kael exchanged a look. There was no time for caution. We take the risk, Sarah said. Kael nodded. We unlock the core. The moment their hands touched the swirling interface, the world vanished. Sarah and Kael were no longer in the core chamber. They stood in a void of shifting stars, their bodies weightless. And then, a presence. Vast. Endless. A will that stretched across time itself. Who are you? The voice was not a voice. It was a force pressing into their souls, demanding answers. Sarah's breath hitched. We are. You are unworthy. A shockwave of power ripped through them, and suddenly, Sarah screamed. She was alone. Kael was gone. The void around her twisted, and suddenly she was elsewhere, standing in a ruined city, the sky filled with fire. Shadows moved in the wreckage. Figures. She recognized herself. Dozens of versions of herself. Some wore armor, battle-hardened. Others had the lifeless gaze of a scientist lost in knowledge. One, cloaked in black, had eyes that burned with something terrible. The worst part? They were all staring at her. What is this? A voice, her own, whispered back. A future. A past. A choice. Kael's world had shattered too. He stood in the throne room of a dead empire. His father, his true father, the warlord he had sworn never to become, sat upon the throne, gazing at him with cold disappointment. You have failed, the voice thundered. Kael gritted his teeth. No, this isn't real. But the voice laughed. If you believe that, then why are you afraid? The throne room collapsed, and Kael fell into darkness. Sarah and Kael fought against the illusions, against the suffocating weight of the core's trial. But the longer they struggled, the more their bond frayed. Sarah gasped, clutching her head. Kael, can you hear me? Silence. She felt the bond snapping. The core was undoing them. No, no, she wouldn't let it. Sarah reached deep into the connection, past the fear, past the illusions, and found him. Kael. A sudden burst of light. The illusions shattered. Sarah and Kael gasped, collapsing back into their bodies. They were still in the core chamber. But something had changed. They could feel it. The bond was different. Stronger. More complete. The Watchers knelt. It is done, their leader whispered. Outside, the Harbinger's ships descended. Sarah rose to her feet. And for the first time, she understood what she and Kael had become. Not just bonded. Not just warriors. Something more. Something the Harbingers feared. Let them come, Kael said. And the battle for the core began. The first blast struck the core's outer defenses, sending shockwaves through the ancient structure. Dust and debris rained down from the vaulted ceilings as the Harbingers' warships opened fire. Sarah and Kael stood at the heart of the core, their minds still reeling from what they had just endured. The bond between them had evolved, no longer just a connection of thoughts and senses, but something deeper, something primal. They could feel the core now. It pulsed beneath their feet, ancient and aware. And it was waiting. We don't have much time, Kael said. If the core falls, everything the ancients tried to bury will be unleashed. Sarah looked at him, her thoughts aligning with his in perfect synchrony. Then we don't let it fall. They turned toward the Watchers, who had already begun forming defensive lines near the entrance. The robed figures, so ancient and reserved, now moved with a terrifying grace, energy weapons humming to life in their hands. The Harbingers seek to control the core, the lead Watcher said. We will die before we let that happen. Kael unsheathed his Telnari warblade, the curved metal glowing with blue energy. We're not here to die. Sarah ignited her plasma rifle. We're here to win. Outside, the Harbingers descended. The battle for the core had begun. The first wave of enemies hit like a storm. Black armored figures surged through the ruins, their movements eerily precise. Their weapons, sleek and curved like bone, fired bursts of crackling violet energy that melted stone upon impact. The Watchers responded with brutal efficiency. Beams of white light lanced through the air, cutting down Harbingers as they advanced. But for every one that fell, two more took its place. Sarah and Kael moved like a single being, their bond guiding their attacks before they even thought to make them. A Harbinger lunged at Sarah. She dodged, before the enemy had even begun the motion, spinning to blast a plasma round into its skull. Behind her, Kael intercepted two more attackers, his warblade moving in sweeping arcs, severing limbs and cutting through armor like paper. For the first time, the Harbingers hesitated. They don't understand how we're doing this, Kael realized. Sarah smirked. Then let's keep them guessing. They pushed forward, cutting through enemy lines, their movements perfectly synchronized. Each time Sarah moved, Kael moved with her. Each time Kael struck, Sarah was already covering his blind spots. The bond had made them something more, something unstoppable. But then, a presence. Cold. Immense. Watching. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Kael, do you feel that? His grip tightened on his weapon. Yes. And then the ground shook. A massive warship descended from the sky, black as the void itself. Its hull was etched with ancient symbols, glowing faintly with a malevolent energy. And from its depths, he emerged. A figure clad in heavy obsidian armor, taller than any Harbinger they had faced. His presence was suffocating, a void in the force of the bond itself. The other Harbingers stopped their attack and fell to their knees. High Warlord Syrinx, Kael murmured, his voice grim. Sarah felt an icy dread coil in her stomach. You know him? Kael's golden eyes burned. I've studied his kind. He was a warlord of the old Harbinger faction. A conqueror. If he's here, it means they aren't just here to take the core. Sarah swallowed. Then what do they want? Syrinx raised a gauntlet hand. The core itself trembled in response. They want to become it, Kael realized in horror. Syrinx's voice echoed through the battlefield, deep and resonant. You have awakened something beyond your understanding. Sarah and Kael stood their ground as the warlord descended the steps of his ship, his footfalls heavy with the weight of his power. The ancients failed because they feared their own potential. They fought amongst themselves, divided, weak. But we, he spread his arms, gesturing to the kneeling Harbingers. We embrace the bond for what it truly is. Kael's grip tightened on his warblade. And what's that? Syrinx smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Ascension. He lifted his hand, and power surged through the air. The core responded, its pulsing light turning dark. Sarah felt a sharp, searing pain in her mind. Her bond with Kael wavered, twisting, fraying. She fell to her knees. Kael staggered beside her, teeth clenched. He's trying to corrupt the bond. Syrinx's gaze locked onto them. You think your connection makes you powerful? His voice was almost mocking. You are children playing with forces beyond your comprehension. Sarah gritted her teeth. Yeah? Then let's see what happens when the children fight back. With sheer willpower, she and Kael forced their bond to stabilize, fighting off the corrupting influence. The core pulsed, and then something else stirred. A voice, deep and ancient, speaking through the core itself. The war must not begin again. The ground split open. The ruins moved. Something beneath the core was waking up. Something even older. Syrinx's smile faded. What have you done? A massive construct began to rise from the depths of Vishara. A monolith of forgotten technology, older than the Watchers, older than even the Harbingers themselves. Its surface glowed with symbols that matched those on the artifact Sarah had first touched. The core was not just a repository of knowledge. It was a lock, and they had just turned the key. The voice from within the core spoke again, louder this time, resonating in Sarah and Kael's very bones. The bonded must decide. The cycle must end. Syrinx's expression twisted into something between rage and desperation. No. He raised his hand, summoning his power to stop whatever was happening. Sarah looked at Kael. He looked at her. And in that moment, they both knew. The bond had made them more than just connected. It had made them chosen. The war was about to begin again. Unless they ended it. Here. Now. Sarah turned to face Syrinx, plasma rifle raised. Kael stood beside her, warblade glowing. Let's finish this. The ruins trembled. The ancient monolith rose higher, its surface glowing with unreadable glyphs, pulsing with energy too vast to comprehend. Sarah and Kael stood at the heart of it, their bond thrumming in time with the core itself. Syrinx snarled, his dark presence pressing against them, his will clawing at their minds like a serrated blade. You do not understand what you are interfering with, he growled. This power is ours by right. The ancients failed because they refused to evolve. Kael's grip on his warblade tightened. And your evolution ends with you ruling over the ashes? Sarah raised her plasma rifle, feeling Kael's certainty through their bond. He was ready to fight. So was she. But the core had other plans. A voice, impossibly vast, echoed through the air, no longer just in their minds, but vibrating through reality itself. The war must not begin again. A wave of force blasted outward from the monolith. The Harbinger staggered. Even Syrinx stumbled, his armor cracking with the weight of an unseen force. Sarah gasped as something pulled at her, at Kael, inside them, through them. They were being given a choice. The core was offering them a power beyond anything they had ever known. A way to end the war. Not just this battle, but the cycle of war itself. But it came with a cost. I see it, Kael whispered. Sarah swallowed hard. So do I. To accept the core's power would mean becoming something else, more than human, more than Telnari. They would no longer just be bonded. They would become part of the core itself, eternal guardians, minds woven into the very fabric of the ancient machine. Or they could reject it. Let history play out as it always had. Fight Syrinx with their own strength. Win or lose on their own terms. The core waited. Syrinx, struggling against the energy pinning him down, snarled. No, that power belongs to us. Sarah met Kael's gaze. Their thoughts merged in an instant. There was only one choice. They reached out and accepted. A flood of light consumed them. Sarah felt herself dissolving, no, expanding. Kael's presence was no longer just next to hers, but within her, around her, a part of her as inseparable as breath from lungs. They were the bond now. Time unraveled before them. They saw the first bonded pair thousands of years ago, when the ancients first created the core. They saw the war that had destroyed them. They saw the Harbinger's endless quest for domination. And then, they saw what could be. A future where the bond did not enslave, where it did not corrupt, where it unified. The core pulsed, reshaping itself around them. They turned their focus to the battlefield. The Harbingers, every soldier, every warship, froze. Syrinx's eyes widened in horror. No, you cannot take this from me. Sarah and Kael, their voices now one, answered. It was never yours to take. With a thought, they unraveled him. Not with violence, not with rage, but with truth. Syrinx's bond, his tether to power, to his twisted vision, broke. His body staggered, shuddering, as the force that had driven him for centuries simply ceased to exist. He collapsed, and the Harbingers, without their leader, without their will to conquer, vanished. The battle was over, and history had changed. The core settled, its light dimming, its vast consciousness withdrawing. Sarah and Kael stood at the center of it all, unchanged in form, but no longer just themselves. They were connected now, not just to each other, but to the fabric of something far greater. The Watchers knelt before them. "It is done," their leader whispered. Sarah turned to Kael, feeling his thoughts entwined with hers. They had won, but they had also become something else. Guardians of the bond. Keepers of the balance. Kael exhaled, something like amusement rippling through their shared mind. "Didn't expect this when we started digging through ruins, did you?" Sarah smirked. "Not even close." They looked up at the endless stars. The war was over, but their journey had only just begun.